Hello. Our story begins on the icy tundra of Hoth. The rebel base was outfitted with tanks and soldiers ready for a strike against the Empire. Echo Base was the home location for the Alliance at the moment. There was a miniature fleet guarding the planet, and new troops were being ushered in and out of the system. Mon Mothma herself was present inside the base itself, and she was joining Princess Leia in her command of the base. Outside, they had gathered a collection of weapons that could be used in case the Empire made a move against them. With a probe droid set up by Captain Solo, it was clear that they needed to prepare the defenses and have an exit strategy ready. With the Empire moving itself towards Hoth, Han and Chewie prepared the Millennium Falcon. There was something about this movement that was special. The Alliance presence at Hoth wasn't like its presence elsewhere in the galaxy. They had an operational base with ground forces that should be able to stand up to the might of the Imperial army. Luke was confused about his place here. He was told by a Force ghost to go to the planet of Dagobah so that he could train with Master Yoda, a Jedi who had instructed Ben Kenobi. But Luke's position was here with the rebels, supporting his friends and fighting the Empire. Echo Base locked down and prepared for combat that would likely challenge their entire movement. Vader's fleet arrived out of hyperspace on the far side of the planet, with Admiral Hazel coming out of hyperspace too early. Yet another Imperial defector killed by the Sith Lord. As the Empire prepared for its ground attack, the rebels were able to distract the fleet. On the other side of the planet, there was a miniature rebel base, one that sat inside of an asteroid belt on the outside of the planet. It was a temporary shipyard, one that was constructed and used to push out cruisers and frigates. None of those cruisers or frigates were present at the planet. They were spread out across the galaxy to help the larger fight. Things have been very different leading up to Vader's arrival outside of Hoth. Ever since Yavin and Alderaan, the galaxy had ruptured into a full-blown civil war. While many inside the capital wouldn't dare give out to the Alliance, there were more donors and quiet allies than there would have been before. This gave the rebellion tools to build more ships and prepare for more combat. The rebels preferred to use mixed fleets, which included Nebulon B frigates, corvettes, quasars, and a number of other, smaller cruiser-like vessels. But here, at Hoth, the Alliance kept a number of its heavy hitters. Some of these including Mon Calamari cruisers themselves. Their plan was to lure part of Vader's fleet to the far side of the planet to engage in a space battle, and luckily for the Alliance, Captain Nita informed the Sith Lord, who dispatched a number of Star Destroyers and support ships to destroy the Alliance base. On the surface, the rebels mounted up into their vehicles. Because of the donors they had acquired, their surface troops were equipped with T-2B repulsor tanks, freshly built for this battle, as well as some old and modified Clone Wars tack. They had AATs and a number of turbo tanks that were updated to be lighter and faster. There were also a variety of other Rebellion-built tanks, but the main point was they actually had a unit of vehicles that they planned on using for ground combat against the Empire, whenever they did land. Inside of Echo Base, Mon, Luke, Leia, and the two droids mounted up. Luke planned on being on the front lines when the Empire arrived, but just as they had hoped, the fleet split. This didn't change anything for the rebellion, mostly because the Empire had vast amounts of forces that would be able to withstand losses, but the fact that the entire Imperial fleet was split up would give the rebel fleet time to counter and potentially send aid to the ground forces. In space, the Empire started with some support vessels, ships that could bite the bullet, and that's what they did. The rebels didn't show too much of their forces. For the most part, it was a very soft skirmish until the Empire deployed its victories in Gladiator-class vessels. This brought forward the first winged MC-80 with a Dauntless-class frigate. These ships were very necessary for supplying the defense of the system and the station. With news of the space battle taking place, Captain Solo and Chewie hopped onto the Falcon and lifted off, launching out of the hangar and cutting through the atmosphere. Han tried to warn Leia of the incoming attack, being that they could see the Executor descending through the atmosphere, with thousands of Imperial troops exiting and preparing for their assault on Echo Base. Vader left his chambers and prepared to lead an extension of the forces down into the back of the rebel base to attack from behind. Han and Chewie arrived in space just in time to aid the dogfight taking place just outside the asteroid belt. The rebels were certainly glad to see them. With the Dauntless holding off fire from various Star Destroyer variants, the rebels called upon more reinforcements before the actual arrival of full-blown Imperial Star Destroyers. While it certainly did appear that the rebels were showing all their cards, they weren't. They had a secret weapon, or two, hiding in their reserves, just out of sight in case the Empire truly wanted to pursue a full-blown attack. Both sides were playing the space battle delicately. Meanwhile, on the surface, the same could be said for the Imperial and Rebel forces. A grouping of AT-RTs moved out as scouts to locate a bundle of stormtroopers trying to find the Rebel base. With a snowstorm moving in, just in time, to cover the field of battle, the fog of war seemed much more an ally to those that called Hoth home. The Empire was sending their best troops in to find their way into the Rebel base so they could capture Skywalker, who Vader was absolutely convinced was here. The assault on the ground then kicked off with Rebel tanks moving in to counter AT-STs. The Empire was sending in their light walkers to test out the legitimacy of the Rebel base. With the extra time and having called Hoth home base, they set up turbo laser towers inside of the shield of Echo Base, which helped cut down the incoming attack of the chicken walkers. With the Rebels taking early victories in both land and sky, their morale was running high. Luke prepared to go out and support the fight, but Leia stopped him, telling Luke that something else was coming. What it was, she was unaware. Outside of the atmosphere, the Empire's first Imperial Star Destroyer cut into the field of vision for the Alliance forces, but the Rebels were ready. As a fear tactic, the Empire dropped the ship out of hyperspace, using a long-range interdiction field. It gave the Fleet Admiral a chance to precisely place the vessel. Despite the fear tactic actually working, the Alliance was prepared with their own counter. Out from the inside of the space station, a wing of Y-wing bombers fled down the hull of the Star Destroyer. 5 wings, to be precise, cut around turbo blasts. With heavy cannons firing turbo and ion blasters, the Rebel fighters were able to avoid the blaster fire with ease as they locked onto their target, which was the shield generator, and they opened fire. Torpedoes dropped out of their bays and slid towards the top of the Imperial Star Destroyer, as detonations crippled the shield system on the ship. While the destroyer was much more equipped for fleet-to-fleet battle than anything in the Alliance fleet, the use of fighters was how the Rebellion would win this war. The Y-Wings broke off and began making runs on different targets on the Imperial Star Destroyer, with a number of the Rebel flagships opening up their heavy cannons on the vessel. Fires erupted, bursting out of the hull of the ship, sending the captain of the vessel into a panic. The Rebels pounced. None of them had an inkling of fear riding through their bodies now. Their confidence was then shot when, from the north, another Imperial Star Destroyer was called in. Captain Solo rounded up the wings of bombers that had just crippled the shields on the previous destroyer and brought them towards the new vessel. It cruised in, facing down the nearly defenseless space stations. While there was genuine ground for the destroyer to cover, with another one facing off against the Alliance fleet, the Rebels felt a little vulnerable at the moment. The destroyer's cannons opened fire from the ship's port side as 5 groups of Y-Wings emerged from the asteroids that littered the space above Hoth. Their viewports toggled in on their target, each member of the squad radioing off to each other, calling out what they were seeing and catching direction from Han Solo, who had completely distracted the TIE bombers within the vicinity. This gave room for the Y-Wings to release their payload. Explosions rocketed off the bridge of the Star Destroyer, as yet another Imperial captain was met with the sick reality of the situation. The Rebel bombers were again too much for their Imperial flagships to handle. Back on the ground, Rebel forces were mounting up, but this fight was no longer chicken walkers versus turbo lasers. The Empire's thousands of forces started approaching the Rebel base in waves, with walkers multiplying by what felt like the second. It wasn't just walkers, but Imperial tanks. The Rebels started deploying their own countermeasure for air superiority, but the Empire had their own forces to protect them against that. It was completely apparent to the Rebels that they were outmatched in this battle, but their fighters, men and women fighting for freedom of all sentience, banded together without a fear in their minds. Inside the tanks, they kept their hands pressed against their triggers. On the ground, soldiers held their weapons with fire in their hearts. No matter the seemingly impossible size of the Empire, the Alliance would triumph. The battle continued to intensify, with Rebel forces immediately shocked by the power of Imperial artillery. They had to resort to using their fully functional droid army. Thanks to these massive donors, the ones mentioned before, they were able to use old technology from the Trade Federation and implement it into the T-2B tanks, which saved a good number of their men and women from being killed first. Most of the actual Rebel forces were operating as soldiers on the ground. With the Imperial war machine closing in, the Rebel resistance stiffened, and with aid from the snowstorm, the battle felt like a potential shot for triumph. Under Echo Base, Luke had been sent to aid a number of Rebel forces with booby-trapping the underground walkways, which included releasing captured wampas on unsuspecting stormtroopers. The first 2 Star Destroyers in space were dealing with extensive damage to their hulls. Without their shields, Imperial Star Destroyers were pretty useless in comparison to the Mon Cala ships. So with their shields down, the Y-Wings followed Han Solo and abandoned the fight with the 2 Star Destroyers, just in time for an Allegiance-class Star Destroyer to break into the fray. With the Executor on the surface of the planet, the Empire deployed its reserve fleet, one that should have had no issue with combating these rebel space forces. Han and the Y-Wings turned back, avoiding the asteroids outside of the planet and making a beeline for the Allegiance. The Imperial Star Destroyers that had already lost their shields began to turn heel to avoid conflict with the main rebel fleet. As they turned all the way back, the Allegiance came under a separate attack. Its support destroyer rounded the starboard side of it, and ran far beyond the range of the rebel long-range cannons. This left the Allegiance to get broadsided by not just the full-blown bombing run, but the heavy cannons of the entire rebel fleet, including the surprise guest Admiral Ackbar and Home 1. Their shields were crippled almost immediately, forcing the Allegiance to choose its direction. With no support ships, she and her captain pulled back around, full to port side. As they did, another Imperial Star Destroyer came in. The attack at the rebel base was so uncoordinated, and it was mostly because the Empire had assumed that they could just run into the rebel space station, rip it to pieces, and return to the surface for triumph and victory over the rebellion. But that was not the case here. The lack of communication left the Empire desperate for some sort of miniature victory in this battle, but it continued to evade them. Captain Solo, while not leading this operation, was able to run cover fire for the Y-Wings, who were responsible for so much damage to this fleet. Due to the lack of fighters in the battlefield, the destroyers were forced to rely on their surface cannons for defense, which wasn't really doing them anything. Home 1 kept herself stationed just inside the asteroid belt and outside the space stations, giving them all the proper protection. The little Imperial fighters that were in the battlefield were getting crushed as the captains of the remaining destroyers looked for a chance to counter the rebel defense. Back on the surface, chaos was erupting. If it weren't for the presence of automated tanks, the rebels would have been crushed. Dozens of AT-ATs were littering the battlefield, not to mention experimental artillery pieces. The Empire was prepared with its array of heavy weaponry, while the rebels had to rely on their numbers, which was very ironic all things considered. The donors gained after Alderaan helped the rebels build up their ground force numbers, which didn't see very much action as it was. This added benefit would give the rebels a chance to overwhelm the Empire. Sadly for them, at the moment on the ground, that wasn't working. Every time the rebels were able to make a successful counterstrike at the Imperial ground forces, more of them showed up. The deployment of troops from the Executor was giving the Empire the upper hand. Though there was one thing truly crippling the assault of the Empire. Their morale was hurting. The support fleet that was supposed to wipe in and destroy the rebel space station wasn't present. On top of that, Vader was missing. He had a cavern dropped on his head, and his men were getting shredded by Luke-led rebels and/or Wampas. Above the caves, the rebels made a push with some spare Hellfire tanks, and tanks only unique for the Empire released hell upon them. They exploded before ever reaching the Imperial landing point. The Imperial Reserve Fleet was crumbling. Home 1 was impenetrable, and the Empire couldn't get past their line of defense. This forced them into multiple different directions. The Allegiance was so badly damaged it was being hunted down by a couple wings of fighters. Han Solo was aiding rebel fighters near the front of their flank, and only one more, completely untouched or undamaged Imperial Star Destroyer remained. However, the bombers that had shredded through the Imperial lines during the battle were ready with one more counter. Instead of Y-Wings, they brought B-Wings, and they crippled another destroyer, allowing Home 1 to use her heavy cannons against it. Being that Admiral Ackbar could see that the battle was coming to a close, he dispatched 2 of his winged MC-80 variants to the surface to bombard the Imperial fleet, and he also dispatched some of the bombers to the surface so they could provide air cover for the rebel ground troops. The battle was coming to a close, and Ackbar understood the importance of seizing control over the battlefield. He did understand, even from his triumphant position here, that he could lose the fleet battle if more forces came. But there was a greater understanding of the long-term fight with the Empire. If they could cripple or destroy the Super Star Destroyer, then it was one less weapon for them to worry about. His decision went into effect immediately. The ground forces, who had been struggling under the unstoppable firepower of the AT-ATs and various other walkers, were aided by a wing of bombers that shredded the ground and the Empire. Stormtroopers were thrown into chaos, above and underground. While they couldn't be seen, the tunnels that the troopers were attempting to use caved in again, which forced Vader to get even more stuck than he already was. Above him, the walkers were in shambles, and what followed was an even more impressive feat from the rebellion. Their tanks crushed through the remaining Imperial forces as orbital bombardments smashed through the retreating Empire. The fight continued to be a tug of war. While the rebellion released enough troops to push the Empire away from the deployment zone, they had reinforcements that came directly from their vessels, but their time for victory had gone. Another bombing run shredded through the last of the exposed walkers, while the snowstorm toppled over a couple more. Lastly, the destroyers that had been landed on the surface were now destroyed as well. It was over, the rebellion had won, but that didn't mean that their decision was done with. Leia and Mon had fully decided on evacuating the planet. There was a message from Admiral Akbar that the Empire dispatched a wounded Victory-class Star Destroyer off-planet, one likely going to get reinforcements. The two MC-80s in the atmosphere provided the perfect cover fire for the retreating rebels. They may have won the battle, but the purpose of Hoth was to have a covert operation. It was no longer that, so the entire rebel fleet prepared to leave. Han picked Leia and Mon up before bringing them back to the hangar of Home 1 and waiting for the rest of the retreat to commence. Luke and R2, on the other hand, completely abandoned the rebel forces and departed for Dagobah, so that they may begin Luke's Jedi training. The evacuation of Echo Base would go smoothly and soundly. By the time Vader emerged from the caverns of ice, they would be gone. His fleet would be ravaged, and all that would remain were the unlucky survivors and the graveyard of his fleet. Rage filled him as he looked at this. The Emperor would be very unhappy. What Vader found were troops who survived the bombardment, but they were not stormtroopers, so they were sealing off what little they could of their ships to keep themselves warm in the freezing temperatures of Hoth. These men could have tried to stop the Alliance from leaving, but it felt purposeless by this point. The rebellion would have likely killed them in their minds, so they avoided trying to fight off a force that just crippled one of their larger, more powerful fleets. It was truthfully a foolish idea to ground the fleet for the landing sequence. The worst part is, the Executors survived the bombardments and bombing runs. It did not, however, survive the lift out of the atmosphere to try and counter the rebellion. Many of the destroyers didn't fully land on the surface, rather they just made it easier to get the troops from the ships to the deployment zone. As the Executor tried to lift off, and because of its damage it received to the center of its hull, the ship split into two pieces and ended up crippling a number of vessels that were hiding under it. Hoth was a total mess for the Empire, strategically and casualty-wise, and the rebels were gone. To where? No one knew. It took them months to even come remotely close to Hoth, let alone find it. With Luke gone, Han, Leia, and Chewie needed to focus on their efforts with the rebellion. Luke's training was beginning differently, and he wasn't distraught over visions, but Luke's mind was warped by his desire to be a hero, and Master Yoda was breaking that foundation and rebuilding Luke into a Jedi. It was something that was necessary for the continuation of the Jedi Order, and Luke eventually came around to it. The rebels split up. Their main fleet was substantial, but in their minds, it was best to spread out. Mon Mothma thought that, with the Empire as vast as it was now, they needed to propel themselves into victory. They couldn't do that with a straight fight, and they could not do that with a peaceful one. They knew what the Empire was capable of, so fighting it head-on wasn't the greatest decision in the galaxy. Riding high after Hoth was a necessary piece of her plan. Mothma and the other Alliance strategists decided that the best way to remove the Empire from its control and grip over the galaxy was for them to spread it thin. Being that everything they could afford to use was present at Hoth, the rebel leaders decided that staging strikes along the Outer Rim at Imperial facilities would gain attention. These weren't full-blown hostile takeovers. What the Alliance planned on doing was bringing hell to Imperial moths of the outer sectors of the galaxy. With the moths placed into uncomfortable positions, the Alliance could strike at individual fleets. The biggest trouble being, their fleet from Hoth wasn't undamaged. If they went with this strategy, they would need to mount up more forces for a true strike at the core. Leia suggested that they rally together forces in the Inner Rim. If they could get a baseline of rebel loyalist systems, they might be able to cut reinforcements from the Mid-Rim in half. The only reason, which perhaps was the biggest reason for this decision to do this, was because the Empire was ever expansive. If they continued in their ways, which would be retreating into the far reaches of the galaxy and mounting up into one singular force, they could lose the long-term battle. In other words, the people were in support of the Alliance, but they needed to give those people, especially Imperial loyalists, a reason to trust the rebels in the long run. The Empire would not die slowly. They would not vanish overnight, and even if there was a peace treaty between the two forms of government, the Empire would prepare for a strike that could cripple any new sense of governing. The rebels feared that the long-term goals of the Empire were eternal longevity. Palpatine didn't want to lose his power, meaning that the Empire would reflect such values. Even if the rebellion won, the Empire would keep coming back. They would hold grudges and they would declare war on a galaxy no matter what era. Mon wanted to prevent that from ever happening. She feared that the Imperial Moffs would flee into the unknown regions if they won the Civil War with an upfront victory at Coruscant. This strategy was born simply to win the war that hadn't begun yet, a way to remove the short-term thinking and focus on the longevity of what they hoped to transform into the New Republic. The biggest support for going into this direction was the Imperial fleet that had returned to Hoth. If they had stayed, they wouldn't have survived. The fleet was double the size and they shredded the entire base. By that point, the Empire was too late. There were no rebels there, but it proved everything the rebels needed to know about this fight. They couldn't win by simply hoping one large battle would cut through Imperial morale. It was a generational curse, built off an ideology started by Palpatine. New recruits to this Imperial military were born under the Imperial flag, and they believed in the Empire because they knew no Republic. They only knew Palpatine. The rebels had to speak against that lie. They had to expose the Empire for what it was, which is where Admiral Akbar came in. He understood that fighting this war would cost civilian casualties, because by elongating the conflict, Palpatine would target innocent civilians to put their efforts to rest. Akbar then cited Nemik's manifesto, and reminded the rebel fighters that the fight would be challenging and at points it would feel impossible, but they had to try. That was their purpose here. This strategy would split the entire force from Hoth up. Han and Chewie were able to fix the Falcon inside of Home 1, and with their forces ready, the Alliance fleet broke into pieces and moved itself across the Inner Rim. From operating in the Outer and Mid-Rims, they were too far away from regular citizens to believe in their logo, but the downtrodden and oppressed knew the symbol of hope. If the Alliance could cement themselves in Imperial territory, the Inner Rim, for example, the status quo of battle would be changed. It truly would, too. But this fight with the Empire became much more of a drawn-out conflict. Conflicts that would erupt in a similar fashion to how they did in the early days of the Rebellion. However, this was different. In the same way the Jedi and the Republic mobilized civilian rebels on Onderon, the Alliance did across the Inner Rim. Out of this came elite units of commandos, some led by former Clone War vets and survivors like Rex, Wolf, and Omega, while on the other hand, new heroes would rise up and make their own names for themselves, including the likes of Shara Bey, Emmeline Holdo, and even Lando Calrissian, who found himself fighting against the Empire. These new faces would become pieces of their fight over the span of months. Due to spreading out so thin, a group of commandos were able to find the second Death Star before the Bothan spies ever had to get murdered to find the plans. As a result, a rebel task force was able to get to the super weapon and kinda capture it, and then detonate it without any Imperial casualties. The Alliance found the second Death Star over Endor before the shield generator was ever finished on the surface. They arrived with their fleet, destroyed a couple of Imperial destroyers, and then plowed through the construction site with ground forces and tanks. They forced Imperial troopers to jettison to the Forest Moon, and then they destroyed the space station, after showing off their act of mercy. This was a publicity stunt more than anything. The rebels showed their kindness to the Imperial troopers, because many of these people were simply here looking for work or newly enlisted men and women. Their fight was not with the Alliance, and while they were semi-stranded on Endor with man-eating teddy bears, a lot of them believed that the rebels had done the right thing, mostly because they didn't destroy the superstructure with them on it. The second Death Star plan fell through really quickly because the rebels found it before any of the armor was placed around the structuring of the actual weapon. It was an easy target, and the rebels sent their victory galaxy-wide. This had sympathizers of the rebellion executed on Coruscant for propping up images of the fight and victory around the core. A lot of those who supported the rebellion from inside the core had very little choice to survive. The major difference with these donors was their grit and their desire to stand against oppression. Regularly, and originally, many of these people didn't care who was in charge, because they were making money. But this was a group of people changed because of the terror inflicted by the Empire at Alderaan. On Dagobah, Luke Skywalker was continuing his training. Everything was going relatively smoothly for him. Without visions of his friends dying, he was completely out of the loop. To him, he felt like he was on Dagobah for only a few short weeks, when in reality, it had been nearly a year. He was toned from physical work, and he was training extensively in the Jedi ways. While he would never give up on his emotional attachments, the Jedi way knocked some of those more human elements out of him. He was alone, with a Force ghost and an individual centuries older than he. It was weird, but in a way, reinvigorating. Something about being on Dagobah made the galaxy feel much smaller, and much more in control. The first few weeks were difficult, but by this point, he woke every day actually committed to learning, not questioning what was possible or impossible, always knowing that through doing was true certainty understood. Luke helped Yoda as well. The elder former Grand Master was struggling in his old age, but Luke's young vibrance had given the Jedi a sense of purpose. Before Luke arrived, he was simply surviving, barely using the Force and just living off the land. He spoke through the Force and connected with those who came before him. He found comfort in what would come, in the end, that he had not been able to see. Yoda was a true master of the Force, but he didn't use its physical attributes much, hence the difficulty with raising the X-Wing from the swamp when it accidentally got submerged. But the main point being, Yoda was vibrant, and he had a lot more life to live. The Galactic Civil War continued to evolve in ways neither the Alliance nor the Empire had predicted. At opposite ends, Mon Mothma and Emperor Palpatine were struggling with finding a place for this conflict to end. With the second Death Star destroyed over Endor, work began on Starkiller Base in the Ilum system. The Empire wouldn't lose this fight, and Palpatine was completely prepared to win this war without having to wait on a backup plan. The issue is, the war was becoming a true grudge match. Alliance forces couldn't compete with the Imperial military. They could, however, sustain long-form combat. They dug in. As they set out to do that, civilian rebel movements got going, and they continued sprouting up. That was the issue. There was only so much the Empire could do against people. This fight was initially one between the Empire and a group of rebels called the Alliance. But after the destruction of the second Death Star, before it finished its construction, the rebellion was able to get people on their side. Initially, there were trillions that supported the rebel movement, but these people were silenced by fear. Now they weren't. And despite the fact that the Alliance hadn't crept into the core, that didn't matter. The Inner Rim was a horrid place to be. Rebel cells supported by the Alliance made stormtrooper lives miserable. Imperial fleets were stationed across every system, which meant as the rebellion was growing, the Empire was spreading itself out even thinner. Since the rebellion didn't need to have all of its forces in one fleet, their fleet had grown exponentially, but they didn't mount it up. They continued using small, sporadic assaults, leaving the Empire without a true place to stop them at. The rebellion had locations, of course they did, like Agen, Kloss, and Crate, but the majority of their forces stayed on the move. The real cripple for the Empire was the loss of the Moff forces in the Mid-Rim. The reason this was so important was because it showed the rest of the galaxy that without Imperial rule, Mid-Rim systems were able to thrive. Criminal syndicates did try to capitalize off this conflict, but the rebellion stood up for the people. So for the regular citizen, their choices were protection with oppression or protection with freedom. Palpatine's regime didn't become any nicer either. In an effort to choke thoughts of rebellion out of their citizens, they went harder on the people. Mass incarcerations began. Floggings, executions, martial law, and mandated curfews were put into effect everywhere. Initially, as the first year after Hoth came to an end, the people were okay with it. These mandates really kicked in overdrive at that 1-year mark after Hoth. But as the months went on, those lockdowns started to drive those people across Imperial territory a little loopy. They were watching people thrive and then looking outside to see their neighbors dragged away by faceless, emotionless, evil stormtroopers. The rebels didn't do that in the Mid-Rim. They were imprisoned by those stormtroopers. In the process of trying to cement their rule, the Empire split their foundation. It was a foundation built on pillars of sand, and the cracks had been showing since the execution of Order 66. It just took 20-some years to get that split to widen. The disillusioned, imprisoned people started to rally together. Underground movements started. Inside the core, the rich continued to feed off the war. But there were billions of people who were not, and on Coruscant, there were thousands of levels that went below the surface of the city world. Thousands of levels filled with billions of people that realized they outnumbered the Empire. The expansion of the Galactic Civil War took a conflict that was originally between rebels and the Empire and transformed it into an evil regime against the people of the galaxy. That was a fight that many Imperial foot soldiers, especially those who were unwillingly drafted, were able to turn against. They couldn't stand for this type of war. They couldn't continue this type of conflict because they were fighting to ensure that their families could be oppressed. Stormtroopers were forced to hurt their friends, their neighbors, and their communities in the greater service of an emperor who didn't see them as anything but numbers. In a weird way, it was the beginning of this year that the war turned from a combative one into a sociological one. Admiral Akbar was extra emphatic about making sure Nemik's manifesto was used on ads to promote the rebellion. However, there was a rebranding to their name. The Alliance, which had strong roots going back to at least 5 years before Alderaan, had to change their branding. This wasn't just a rebel cell or a small and isolated movement, it was a galactic desire for change. That fact aided what the rebels hoped to do with their movement being renamed into the New Republic. It was a show of unity with the entire galaxy, and it rallied people together even more. In a weird way, the Alliance and Rebellion felt unofficial. With the crowning of the title New Republic, the galaxy fully united. For 3 years, this conflict would continue. At the end of those 3 years, with very little interaction with his friends, Luke would return following Grandmaster Yoda's passing. Luke had become a true Jedi Knight, skilled with not just the Force but his lightsaber. Yoda had given over all the information he could in such a short period of time, and it made Yoda wish that in another lifetime, he had trained Anakin on Ahch-To, away from the rest of the galaxy, so that they could focus on the studies of a true Jedi. Luke returned with a new understanding of the Force and life, and what it meant to be a Jedi. What he found when he returned was a very different galaxy. Leia and Han visited Dagobah once or twice. Leia and Luke learned that they were siblings, and the new couple, Han and Leia, were able to tell him about the changes. But speaking only did so much for what had actually happened. Not to mention all those changes, but there was also their son, Ben Solo, to show off. The conflict was galaxy-wide, and the Imperial fleet was split up so badly that there were hardly any large fleets left in their navy. What was the Navy was fleets of 2 to 5 Star Destroyers and a couple support ships placed at every other system. The trouble that beset the Empire the most was the people. They could forge incredible weapons. They could manufacture a fleet unlike any other the galaxy had ever seen. But none of that could compare to the unison of the galaxy against that Emperor. He was out on Starkiller, while Vader was left aimlessly searching for his son who had disappeared off the galactic map. The Emperor's plan to hide Starkiller seemed brilliant, until the expansive New Republic fleet found their facilities and shelled it into oblivion, preserving what little remained of the planet and killing the Emperor in a blast that would send the Sith Lord into dust. Despite the semi-anticlimactic nature of Palpatine's death, the true fight between the New Republic and the Empire came with a small skirmish over Coruscant. Small could not be overstated. The New Republic dropped a fighting force that was small in comparison to what was seen at Hoth. The Empire couldn't offer much of a fight. Due to the mass scale of the Galactic Civil War and the fact that people were no longer just working for the Empire, they could no longer afford to build destroyers because once the workers were gone, all that were left were draftees, who didn't really know how to build StarTech. Without a true industrial force, the Empire had to live off of what they had, and it truthfully, even in its magnificence, was not enough. Nemik's manifesto remained a rallying cry for this rebellion. It would be at Coruscant where Luke would face off against his father. Their duel would transpire on the surface of the planet. The young Jedi hadn't crafted his own lightsaber yet, and he was still using the blade of his father, Anakin Skywalker. As the space battle started to catch steam in the orbit of the heart of the galaxy, father and son were engaging in a battle on the surface. A rebel task force led by General Solo and Captain Omega were making a push against a hypervelocity cannon on that surface. Luke, with all of his Jedi training, knew who Vader was, but the Sith Lord didn't know that his son knew that. Their blades clashed together. Initially, it was slow, and while Luke was here to stop his father's loyalty to the darkness, he wasn't going to give this fight away either. He stepped to the side, ducking under Vader's wide swing, before bashing his lightsaber forward, catching his father off guard. He blasted the Sith backwards, watching him regather his strength and focus in on the actual fight. Luke had been warned by Obi-Wan and Yoda to tread lightly. Vader wouldn't be kind to him as an opponent. And it became clear as soon as Vader learned that his son wasn't unprepared for this conflict, and their blades interlocked again. In space, the Rebel flagship entered the fray as Imperial light cruisers and destroyers tried their hardest to hold off the approaching New Republic. They were calling for reinforcements, but none were showing themselves. The New Republic came in with a fighting force that completely hindered the ability of the Empire. The fighter assaults were countered, but even with everything the Empire had learned in the past few years, it wasn't enough. Y-Wings and B-Wings were vessels capable of crippling any destroyer used by the Empire. The bombers ran down the trench line of the Imperial Star Destroyers and smashed through their shields, which gave a chance for the Alliance to call in some vessels. They had endurance destroyers, including an array of other Mon Cala vessels that entered the fray. With a combined force of freedom fighters and civilians, the Empire was forced to back down. When all seemed lost, a hypervelocity cannon unloaded its heavy round into the space battle. But its target was not the rebels. It was the Empire, and it only confirmed for the naval fighters that their war was over. Luke and Vader's fight moved from the street into a civilian transport. Not a large one, but a vessel that could carry 20 to 30 people. It was empty at the moment, thanks to Imperial curfews, but the ship took off due to the programming and fled the system. The two duelists didn't even notice. Their blades continued pacing off of each other, Luke and Vader refusing to give the other an inch. As the ship prepared to jump into hyperspace, they finally noticed, and the young Jedi sidestepped a strike from Vader, who, while testing his son, was not trying to kill him. Luke slammed forward, cutting not through Vader's hand, but through his mask, removing a chunk of it, forcing Anakin's eye to become visible, and Vader to fall back against the ground. Luke pointed his Jedi weapon at the ground and told Vader that he was beaten. It was time to give up. The Dark Lord, one who now held the lineage of the Sith with him, looked at Luke with his own eyes. He knew that he could not reasonably continue this fight. That was his son right there. This had gone far enough. He wanted to try and continue to fight, but it was purposeless. The Empire was gone, the Sith were dead, and he was left with no family. But that family could be his again. Thanks to being in hyperspace, Luke and Anakin had time to make amends, end the Sith lineage and begin anew. Vader couldn't be seen though, so Luke would have to tell everyone that he killed the Dark Lord. For Anakin, who was hiding out on a remote world, it was a bit jarring to see a mass celebration at the news that he was killed by the last Jedi. But that was the reality of who he was. Nemik's manifesto had stated that the smallest act of insurrection pushes the line of the Alliance further. The frontier of the rebellion was everywhere, and it was proved right here. The conflict with the Empire didn't just vanish, but the victory over Coruscant was a triumph to signal to Imperial forces that it was over. Due to how grueling the conflict had become, the final battle wasn't fought between Empire and New Republic. It was a splinter group of Imperial loyalists fighting their last fight against Imperials who had seen the light. The Empire was not a system for the people, and the loyalists who believed in that system paid with their lives. When the conflict was truly over, a New Republic would rise to become the center of leadership in the galaxy. They would be led by Chancellor Mon Mothma, and as per her strategy, with the Empire truly gone, they could focus their efforts on rebuilding democracy, not maintaining autocracy. The fear of continuing the New Republic military was that it could inspire growth of another evil regime. The purpose of a military was for war, and with the Empire dissipating, not vanishing, it was time for peace. The actual demilitarization of the New Republic would take years to complete, but when it was done, there were no more threats. The war had come to a conclusion shortly before Thrawn returned to the galaxy, and his badly damaged Chimera would not survive its first encounter with the Imperial traitors in the Outer Rim. Ezra would join up with the New Republic and celebrate the rebirth of the galaxy, even joining up with Luke in the near future to assist him with the beginning of the new Jedi Order. Luke and Anakin would have a stable relationship. While it wasn't the best way to start things, at least they were able to start rather than slip away. Leia and Anakin never ever got a relationship started, especially after the war going on for 7+ years, not to mention Alderaan. Palpatine's regime was beaten back by a collection of people, not a rebellion and not a New Republic. The people of the galaxy chose this change selectively and with intent, not a lack of care. The New Republic was the people of the galaxy, and with great change on the horizon, it would be through this system that the galaxy would find order. In the years that followed, these ideals would flourish. The Empire and even its remnant were destroyed. The few who still remained loyal to the dead system found their place in the Outer Rim, joining or starting criminal movements that would die out within the coming decades. The presence of the New Republic was unlike any other seen in generations. With the Jedi rising up, the darkness fled, and the galaxy was permanently healed under the leadership of the people. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to all of our patrons. Benjamin Wells, Ozpin, Angel Dust, Alexander Reese, The Beginning and End, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Grid 36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, Jango Fett Clone, Nick 5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Puremark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tib, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Granny Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cully Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewood 670, Annika Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, John Nguyen, Sansa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Cali, Galaxy 66, Mammoth Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Force Lisa Star Wars, Airbus, Rex the Wolf, Me 3 First Names, Darksing 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button, support me in ways. I'll be streaming Star Wars Outlaws on Twitch. Here's a clip of me in Battlefront 2 from the other day.
Yeah! Eat rebel scum! I'm a chicken walker! Yeah, I'm not so chicken now, am I? No, I'm not! Yeah, you fear me!
And whatever else you want to support. Anyways, let's talk about this story. So, the Battle of Hoth is obviously kind of put into steroids, and I kind of wanted it to go that way. I wanted it to have this preemptive rebel movement that could handle its own against the Imperial fleet. Obviously, you guys were very ecstatic about the Imperial Civil War that I had just done a hot minute ago, so I was like, alright, let's include ground battle, space battle, so hope you guys enjoyed that aspect, but I also kind of like the idea of making the war between the Rebel Alliance and the Empire being a conflict that wasn't just Rebel versus Empire, and so I try to include both the war between the First Order and Resistance and the war between the Empire and the Rebellion in this, and so it's kind of a combination, and the idea that I went into this is that Mon Mothma isn't playing the short-term game. So much of her career is about playing the long-term, and I believe that in the long term, she would want to stop the preemptive rise of the Empire or the rise of the First Order, because knowing the Empire, they were going to do that inevitably. So, kind of taking what we did in the Luke and Leia Save Padme video, but kind of taking it a step further where they're taking care of the Empire before they ever get a chance to do Starkiller or build the First Order and try and make a return. So I hope you all enjoyed the story. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.